Okay. You see the results?
I do.
Okay.
I hope that means our attendees do too. So we have the entrance poll. We know we are thinking about blended learning here in the title, and that's hopefully what brought you to the webinar. But we know that since we started work on this series, things might have changed for you, and we've seen that happen with our partners. We have partners joining us today from Michigan, from Pennsylvania, from Texas, all the way on the West Coast in California and Oregon as well. So many of you are starting the year completely digital. Some of us are blended, and some of us are more toward the in-person side of things. But we know that at some point during the year, even if you are starting virtual, that you may be switching back and forth. And so what we really want to focus on today and throughout this series are some strategies that can transfer between the mediums where the big tent poles are the same. The execution might be different, and we can talk a little bit about how that will be different throughout the series. But those big overarching strategies of how we approach, that we can use to approach each phase of the learning cycle can still be the same for us. So we'll go ahead and get started today. We'll stop sharing those results. We'll close them here. For those of you that are just joining, what's projected for you there is our Pear Deck address. We'll be using that to facilitate some interaction, some conversation with you. So please go to joinpd.com and use that access code NNQWI to go ahead and join our class. And we will get ready to proceed once we have a few more folks that are in there with us. I'll give you another minute or so to see that code. If you miss out on that, that code will still be displayed in the upper right-hand corner of our screen. And we'll go ahead and get started. For those of you who are still joining, again, that address is joinpd.com, and the code is shared up there in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, NNQWI. So welcome, here you are with the Institute for Research and Reform in Education. I'm Randy Lober, that's Dr. Anissa Collins, and you're here, and we're talking about the lesson cycle and blended formats and planning for the hook. How do we get kids involved in the learning, whether they're in front of us face-to-face or whether they're on the other side of the computer, as you are from us at the moment. I'm there on the left. That's my Bitmoji in our virtual classroom here. You see me there, picture with my family and my toddler Eli there making his big old cheesy face. I'm
Uh-oh, Randy, did you freeze? You gotta love technology, y'all. So Randy, this is me. And unfortunately, he's sharing his screen. So we're going to give it just a second. Bear with us for just a moment. And if he doesn't pop back on, then I will share my screen and we'll go from there. Oh, you're back, Randy.
Screen still?
Do what? I'm sorry?
My screen is still shared?
Yes.
Okay, good news. Okay, so sorry about that. I heard you start picking up the introduction. So did you have any of your introduction left to do?
I don't think so.
Okay. So that is Dr. Anissa Collins. I'm Randy Lober. I'm a senior instructional specialist here with IRRE. And we're here to talk with you a little bit and engage some conversation around helping our students through this learning cycle, no matter what medium we find ourselves instructing in. We have three big outcomes today. We want to first be able to define the hook as part of the lesson cycle and come to a consensus on what that means. You're all educators. You've all been in the field for varying lengths of time, and you have an understanding of what the hook is, but we want to make sure we have a clear and common definition that we're working toward here. We want to identify some criteria for deciding whether or not we're going to hook the students at home or in school. Now, obviously, if you're all blended, well, that decision is made for you, right? But for those of us who are working in blended contexts, we're speaking to you throughout some of this, although as we said, the strategies we share here can be transferred throughout mediums. And as well, when our students are at home, and this is where those of us who might be working from home for the year, we wanted to talk about some strategies for hooking students at home. And so we'll take a look through that progression of ICANNs as we move through our session here today. We have a few ground rules for our webinar and our time together. We'll begin and end on time. We are scheduled for 1 hour and we will keep you no more than that. So please stay focused as we do have conversations and be respectful and assume positive intent. You're all here taking time out of your summers to learn a little bit more about this topic and engage in some conversation. And that's a great thing. So please honor that positive intent. And know that when people are speaking their truths, that's where they're coming from. They're coming to us as learners. We'll ask you to use the chat and Q&A features to help facilitate our conversation. And please do mute your microphones when you are not speaking. Nissa will be helping us monitor the chat today. So please share your questions and ideas in the chat. Normally in a classroom or in a PL room, we're like, no, don't do sidebars. That's a bad thing, right? Because you're not paying attention to me and I'm the star of the show. But here you're the star of the show and your learning is what matters. And that back channel conversation is a great opportunity to do that as you talk and share ideas with each other. So we highly encourage that. We'll track and respond to those questions where we can. We'll have a Q&A session at the end. We'll pause some throughout the session. And if we don't have time and opportunity to respond to you within inside the session, we will make every effort to follow up with email to help address any concerns you might have. And we do want to let you know that the session is being recorded as well as the chat. The chat more so we can follow up with some of those concerns or questions that we might not be able to attend to. But the session is being recorded so we can forward it to people who were not able to attend today. And so they have access to the same great thinking and knowledge that you are about to share with us as well. So it would be kind of oxymoronic, I guess, for us to talk about the hook without having you engage in a great hook activity. So here's what we'll ask you to do. For those of you in the Pear Deck app, you should see this slide, and in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you should see some tools that'll let you make an answer to this prompt. So we're going to ask for some.
Okay, so if he's frozen for you guys, the prompt is what might be an effective lesson cycle will look like. Please draw your response to the right. So in your Pear Deck, if you're in there, go ahead and use the drawing capabilities and draw your representation of an effective lesson cycle.
Yes, thank you.
There's a whole bunch of people on the internet at the same time in Detroit, Randy.
Must be the case. We are seeing some responses coming in. I note that you have text boxes available to you down at the bottom as well. And we'll go ahead and show off some of your artwork as well. So don't feel a huge pressure to be Picasso, right? We don't need to be Picasso. We're just looking for you to think outside the box and show us what our learning looks like here. We'll give you another 90 seconds or so to think about your responses. I'm seeing some fantastic artwork, multicolored, green, purple, orange. We're seeing some things that where students are really enthusiastic about the learning. Please go ahead and show us your best thinking.
And for those of you just joining, I'm putting the web address and the access code to Pear Deck in the chat so that you can add in as we go through. It's a great way to engage the kids either during a synchronous session when we're doing our remote teaching.
Okay, we'll go ahead and take a look at some of your responses here. This is what one thing that Pear Deck allows us to do is to take a look at some of your artwork. It's all anonymized. So if you see your drawing, fear not. We're not calling any names out, but I just highlighted a few responses here. So some of us really took that cycle thing to heart, right? We know that there's an ongoing cycle here in the learning. A lot of us are saying that there's a beginning where we might start a little confused. We have that eureka in the middle, and then we end with those happy faces. We see the progression of learning happen here throughout, and there are a few other neat representations as well. The idea here, though, is we got some thinking jogged here about what learning might look like, and we want to thank you for sharing that with us. That's got your brain in the right space to engage with the rest of our conversation here today, and we'll go ahead and build some of that common ground that we started talking about with the definition by clarifying our terms. So generally, we accept the lesson cycle as this. Learning begins with a hook. We move on to new learning. We move into guided practice. We would then move into independent practice, and the lesson closes and then repeats itself as we move on to new and additional learning topics.
And I think he left off at new learning topics. So after that, then oftentimes we ask the kids to do that application piece with that guided practice. Sometimes it's having them work with another classmate. Sometimes it's us helping to guide them before we have them to that independent practice. So as we think about the gradual release of responsibility, which is oftentimes what some of us use in our lesson planning and learning and lesson design, the new learning is oftentimes the I do piece, the guided practice is the we do, and the independent practice is both that you do together as well as the you do alone.
Thank you. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the lesson cycle, is those discrete stages. And our focus today is that hook. So what do we mean by that? When we're thinking about hook activities, that hook portion of the lesson, we know they're short. They're 3 to 10 minute activities that we are using to really get students and engage in the learning and get them thinking about what's happening. So they're going to be thought-provoking. They're going to be starting with an image. They're going to be asking you to do something a little bit outside the box, such as your drawing a little bit earlier today. Or they ask you, they grab your attention in a different way. It's something that gets us thinking about the learning at hand. It prepares learners for what they're about to do. So we know, again, that we're not bringing new knowledge to the table with this particular thing, but we want to make sure that we are all coming from the same place and understanding what we mean by a hook as we dig further into some strategies to make that really pop for our learners at home and at school. So we want to pause here and ask you to reflect on your experiences with planning hook activities. What are some examples of hook activities that you have used in the past, and what types of activities seem to be most effective? So same thing in Pear Deck. You'll have an opportunity to answer this question down in the bottom right, and this will be a typing question. No need to draw this time. So feel free to go ahead and share your responses with us. What are some of those things you've used in your classrooms?
And if anybody has not been able to get onto Pear Deck, fear not, you can always share your ideas and thinking in the chat.
Okay, we're still seeing a few responses come in. So we'll give you an opportunity to get those in, and then we'll share some of that thinking that you're sharing with us. Okay, so this is still anonymized, but we can see a few more responses here at once. So we're seeing some different themes here, right? Some movies, videos, anything tech involved, and certainly when we're in a distance learning situation, technology is going to play a big role in that. Using photographs or songs or speeches are another way to grab student interest, and we'll talk some about that method in particular. Poll everywhere. So as you entered today, we got you thinking a little bit about how you were approaching the year. We wanted to find out some information, but certainly we could articulate those polls in different ways to get student opinions. Looking at TED Talks and TED Ed features as well as poems is another way to grab student interest, as well as some short videos or songs or other probing questions to really get students involved in thinking about the task at hand. So thank you for sharing those. We'll keep all of those ideas. They're living on here in the recording, but the neat thing about Pear Deck is after we're done with this session, all these ideas that you're sharing will be shared with you as well. So we're aggregating some of these ideas for us as well. And also we'll give you a brief summary of the chat here. So please do keep those conversations flowing. Even if you don't see your response here, it doesn't mean it's not being looked at, or it doesn't mean it won't show up anywhere else. We're just trying to capture some of those big ideas that are coming up as you share your responses. So we'll want to talk today then about good hooks and better hooks. And especially in this era where we may be distance learning, and if not now, a little bit later on in the year, how do we decide what kind of hook makes the most sense for how my kids are learning and what venue they're currently learning in? And we start here with this image of two paths diverging in the wood. While there may not always be a road less followed in this case, we might always be going down the digital learning path, and some of us are being forced on that path. Our big message that we really want educators to think about this year is professional judgment. More than any year in the past, because of all the unique
Okay, we lost him again. He moved his, this is what happens when you try to make space for your two children to play while you and your wife are working at home. So the idea, of course, is that judgment, that we have to make a decision. That's what we do every day as teachers. And so in just a second, Randy's going to talk to us about how do we decide, especially for us that are in the blended environment, how do we decide what's really good to do at home, have the kids do at home versus when we have them in person, because that time is so valuable.
Thank you. So as we go forward, we'll frame the conversation as good match and better match. And that framing is deliberate, right? Because we know just when we're in-person instruction, all these phases of the instructional cycle are good things for us to do. But when we have this blended approach and this blended learning, there's some things that make more sense for us to do when kids are with us, and some things that make sense for us to do when kids are at home. So when we think about the hooks in in-person learning, we'll talk about that as a good match. And so if I'm going to have this big hook activity, it really makes good sense to do when that demonstration experience is most compelling when it's seen live. So a good example of that might be in a physics class if I'm having that test the coil demonstration. That just is not going to have the same power. I'm waiting for laughter, but I don't hear it. As a video presentation or video representation of a test the coil might have. So that's something I might want to do with kids in the room with me. If there's in-person simulation, so in my social studies classes, if we're thinking about trading or economics, and we know that resources management is another issue that we can talk about a little bit later on in the series, but that's something that's going to hook kids, and it's really valuable for them to participate with in the classroom. So if the hook is so powerful, it benefits from the in-person experience, that's a good reason to plan that activity to happen inside the classroom. But we also know that, as many of you mentioned in the warm-up, that a lot of the best hooks are based on some digital media, whether that's a poem, a video, a picture, or something else. And so oftentimes a hook is an even better match for that at-home or distance learning. So whether that's responding to an image via the picture inductive model, which we'll talk about in some more detail today, whether that's responding to those quotes or texts, or whether that's us are posing an example problem to them to generate some curiosity about, so wait, how do I calculate the area of a square? Or why do I need to calculate the volume of a cone? Because does a cake cone have more volume than a waffle cone? And how do I get the most ice cream for my money? Those are all excellent hooks that we could use, but all things that we could hook students while they're at home with. The in-person presentation is not quite as compelling as that test the coil demonstration. So I want you to think back to either the effective hook you discussed during the warm-up, so during your last opportunity to type, or during some of the examples that we discussed here. Which of them might be most suitable to remote learning? So take a moment to chat about, or to either chat about that or answer in Pear Deck. Out of the possibilities you discussed and out of the possibilities we shared, which is most suitable for remote learning? And I hope I'm just quiet because I'm waiting for answers to come in and not because I've frozen. Okay, we still see some answers coming in, but there's a few themes emerging, and one answer that captured a lot of everything, or most things that are the human theme, most of the things that are coming in. So we want to highlight that here as well. So certainly videos, photographs, and poems are all great ways to hook kids in. And that's echoed there, that second response. Short text passages like quotes can certainly bring kids into the fold as well as photo teasers and journal responses. So if there's a photo here about what we're going to learn about, and presumably the follow-up is that we're going to have kids write about that, that's a great connection here as well. So all those are great strategies, and all those are good examples of what might work best at home. We want to dig a little bit deeper into some of those strategies as we go forward here in our session. So we're going to look at 3 strategies in particular today. We have time within our hour to really talk about 2 of them in depth, but we do want to talk about 3 of them, and those are the picture inductive model, the word splash. Those first 2 are the ones we're going to experience and talk about in some detail today, but we'll also talk about alternate response and how we get kids responding in a variety of formats. Anissa, before we experience those strategies as participants, what can you add to us about some of what the research says about these strategies?
Sure. So obviously there's always research out there, and we can always start with Bob Marzano in his really in-depth meta-analysis of what works for kids, which is still works for kids. That hasn't changed in the last few years. So when we think about the picture inductive model and word splash especially, that really hones in on that idea of a non-linguistic representation. That's the picture inductive model, and really helping kids use visuals to connect and make connections with other content, especially the more abstract for our older kids. And then word splash very much deals with vocabulary, which is so critical, as you guys know. So it's a really great and easy and flexible activity that we'll look at. The alternate response, we won't talk about quite as much today, but the alternate response is really just getting kids to answer in a unique and novel way. So if they're writing a poem, if they're writing a rap, if they're creating a menu, if they're actually making like a Flipgrid video. So just those types of things that are novel and different. Along with the word splash and picture inductive model, for a lot of kids, that's all that's needed in order to reactivate that brain. And as we look at David Sosa and some of the other brain research out there, that novelty is really what is critical for getting kids to be engaged and keep them engaged so that they make those critical connections.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. We'll go ahead and start and talk about some of these in some further detail. We're going to give you a chance to experience the picture inductive model first, and then see a few different examples from a few different disciplines. And we note in the sidebar that we're stressing the at home. So certainly you are learning at home or wherever you are that's not at work. And so we want to really try and model and replicate what that experience might be like for students using Pear Deck here. As certainly though, the same principles, the same basic structure of the strategy can be applied to in-class learning as well. So we'll make sure that we break out some of the basic steps and how the 2 implementations might be parallel. So we first see this image here of George. Well, I'm not going to tell you what, because I'm going to ask you to respond to this question. What do you notice about this painting? So please go ahead and take some time in Pear Deck to respond to that prompt. What do you notice about this painting? What do you see?
Oops. And now we definitely lost Randy.
Oh, I'm here.
Oh, you are here. Okay, good.
I'm here. Yep. But so we still see some responses coming in here. We're seeing some of those, and I want to highlight some of those. So we see George Washington, we see the flag and a raging river, the pilot in the front, and there's some activity going on behind. We see some ice that have not have been there. We see George Washington leading. It's cold. We know it has something to do with America because of the flag, and we're struggling to roll. We see some ice around the boat. So there's lots of different things going on here, and that's where we're going to start with. I want you to keep those thoughts and hold those thoughts as we go forward here.
And Randy, you're seeing your screen. So that's why I asked if you were still there.
Okay, let me bring my screen right back. Okay, there we go. So hold those thoughts that you just had about the initial things and your initial reactions and what you just saw. And now take an opportunity to respond to this prompt. What might the artist be attempting to communicate about the subject of this painting, and what clues might suggest that? So please go ahead and jot some additional thinking here. You're going to be starting a new response in Pear Deck, and share some of your thinking and knowledge here. Okay, I will give you another minute or so to get some responses in. We're seeing a lot of lengthy and thoughtful responses, so I appreciate the thinking that you're sharing here. Okay. So as the presenter, I can see where a few of these responses are coming from, and leave it to some of our English teachers to say that the artist is trying to communicate that they're a courageous leader here. We see some symbolism, right? Where he's upright in the midst of the perilous trip. And others have confidence in because they're putting effort in rowing the boat safely to the other side. We're seeing that great things are worth hard work. They're working hard to get across the river to display the flag. We know that we're struggling together. Those in the boat are continuing to move forward. So as you may know, the painting that we've been discussing here is George Washington crossing the Delaware during the midst of the American Revolution. He's standing strong and stout. He is, though there's a battle raging around him in these raging waters, he is crossing the Delaware River here. So all the things that you just said, and what this does for me in a history classroom or an art history classroom is really gets us thinking about, well, what's that like? What does this mean here? And what can I learn next about this? Why is George Washington standing upright? Who is he? Right? This might have a great place at the beginning of one of those units. It might be a great review toward the end of a unit. But this particular picture inductive model might be used anywhere throughout. And so what we want to highlight then is that there's a few different steps to executing a picture inductive model. And these steps are similar whether we are face-to-face or remote. First, we start with consuming the media. So in this case, you had an opportunity to just view that picture and sit with it for a minute and see what you were able to see. I then asked you to respond to a low complexity prompt. So these are things that you notice, you feel, you see, you hear. Those very visceral reactions we have to the media. That again can happen from a video or an audio recording as well. If I have a short 30-second video or a short 30-second audio clip, we can ask students to record some of those reactions. We then gave you an opportunity to share that thinking. If you are in a synchronous section like this, Pear Deck is a great way to capture that. You could also use the chat feature in Google Meets. If I were doing this asynchronously, I might have students respond to a discussion post or respond to a Flipgrid post where I had this image as the subject. We then asked you to respond to a higher complexity prompt. These are ones that ask you to use evidence-based reasoning. So as you cited different details from the painting, you were engaged in that. You might be asked to make connections to different subject areas or ask how this picture relates to what we're studying, or you might simply be asked to make some predictions or wonderings about the topic at hand or where we might be going next. But the key part is that you had the opportunity to share your thinking. In this case, that happened via Pear Deck. But other cases that might happen via peer conversations or as part of that synchronous session. And that's an important element, right? That we all have an opportunity to share and sample and test some of that thinking with each other. So in synchronous sessions in a remote setting, the peer-shared inductive model works much like we just described. We could also envision that we have discussion boards where we post images for students to respond to. And the process works much the same when we're face-to-face with our students as well. We could post a picture and again have them respond to those two prompts, inspecting thinking along the way. So in a nutshell, that's the picture inductive model. I want to look through a few more examples of what that might look like before we pause for some questions about it. So it could work in a math setting too, right? Where we have an equation there focused on the order of operations at the top. And we ask students to simply note what they notice about that equation. So they might notice that there's parentheses. They might notice a variety of signs that are being carried out and a variable at the end that they need to solve for as some examples. We then might ask them to start brainstorming about what steps they might need to take to solve for that. So this could be at the beginning of a lesson, right? Where we're asking them to really kind of generate some of that learning and some of that thinking and make some predictions on their own. But it also might be a great mid-learning review that this particular exercise might be applied to.
And Randy, for our math folks out there, we know how difficult it is to have the kids stop down and share their thinking and their thought processes as opposed to just go through the motions and solve it. They always want to just think that they have to solve and find an answer. So this is a good way to get them to do that type of thinking that you want them to do and that they're expected to do, so that we can really get a much better picture of where they are and what they understand.
That's absolutely right. And that is one of the benefits of the PIM in general, is that it can help make student thinking visible. First, what do you notice and what are you thinking? Then, well, why do you think that? And it's a really short 2-question approach to really elevate and make that learning pop. Another example here, if you are in Pear Deck, you can simply hit play here and you'll see a short video of a car cranking. Or a car attempted being started, but not cranking and not starting here. So you're going to get some short audio. Of the car not doing what it's supposed to. And so we might ask what students to notice and note what they see and what they hear. And then on a second viewing of that video, to make some guesses. Why are they seeing and hearing those things? Why might the car not be cranking? Why might it not be turning over? And what might we do about that? For another math application, we might ask students to simply note what they notice about these two shapes. How many sides do they have? How many angles do they have? What do they notice about the area? Is one smaller? Is one larger? Are they congruent? Are all possible student responses? And then we might ask them to think a little bit a step further and ask them to draw lines of symmetry in these shapes. And that might generate a good conversation for us to really investigate what they're thinking about and how they see symmetry. If we see students, for example, draw a line across the pentagon, so a horizontal line across the pentagon or a horizontal line across the triangle, that gives us a good indication or check for understanding that there may be some things that we need to revisit with those students. So it's another way to, again, prompt some of that check for understanding here toward at the beginning of the lesson for us.
And Randy, a couple of things that have come up as well in the chat this is also a really great way with the picture inductive model to inspire the kids to write their own questions. So it could be, what are the questions that come to mind as you look at this, whatever this is, whether that's that short video clip or whether it's an actual picture or a diagram. The other thing that I wanted to bring forward that I've heard from in the past is that idea of scaffolding, right? And we all have kids, whether they're labeled or not, that struggle and need to have that first step before they can get to the second. And that's what picture inductive model does. It goes beyond showing a video and saying, what do you think? It's that first question that really gets every kid involved, which is, what do you notice? Or what do you see? What do you think? What do you predict? Anybody can answer those types of questions. Then it gets into having them dig deeper and think deeper about that. So that's the really great of it, as well as for us, as Randy said, it can not only be a hook in engaging the kids, but it can be a check immediately for us.
Thank you for adding that and for calling some of those ideas from the chat. We also want to give you an opportunity to do your own brain dumps here if you haven't dumped into the chat yet, and think about some possible uses of the picture inductive model in your current position. So we're seeing some responses already come in. We'll give you an opportunity to respond to that question here, where we'll talk about some of those here in just a moment as well. Again, some really thoughtful responses coming in. We'll give you another minute or so to finish up your responses before we share them, so we don't show your work in progress, so to speak. We'll show your finished product. Okay, so let's take a look at what some of us are thinking here. So certainly in a science aspect, or any other discipline that uses models, and we know that most of our disciplines do, we can certainly have students identify the parts of a model of whatever phenomenon we're taking a look at. We can think about it as a journal prompt for them to explore the concept of themes. Certainly in the social studies realm, seeing some examples of physical and human geography and asking them to compare and contrast those different phenomena that we see. And certainly it's a great strategy for limited English proficient students, but it's also a good strategy for all students, right? So where we have opportunities we know that this strategy is a way to help limited LEP students access the language and really get involved and show us what they know and how they're able to access the discipline. But that's also a powerful strategy for our other students to get engaged in as well. Those learners who might otherwise be reluctant, as Anissa talked about. Everyone can tell us what they see. And now that I've already got my toes halfway in the water and I'm wiggling a little bit, I'm then that much more likely to respond to that second prompt that asked me to do a little bit more tougher thinking. So certainly, that's a great application of the strategy, and that response really highlights the usefulness of the strategy, not just for students who are LEP, but for all students, right? That can help them really get them into the lesson, and that's one of the reasons we highlight this strategy first, because it gets everyone some skin in the game right away.
And it's also a good one that we can use whether we're in person, whether we're doing a synchronous session, or whether we're doing some asynchronous activities with our kids. Because that's the other thing that we tried to think of is what are some of those that are really good, high quality strategies that we don't have to do something completely different depending on which environment the kids are in.
The second strategy we want to talk about today, and what we want you to experience from a synchronous perspective, but obviously we're still remote, is the word splash. And the best way to learn about word splash is to do one, so that's what we'll ask you to do. I'll give you a little bit of context first before you get started. So suppose you were at a professional learning session that asked you to learn a little bit about brain research here, right? And how the brain works and how student brains in particular access knowledge, retain knowledge, and what conditions have to be in place for the brain to be ready to receive that knowledge. would you please drag your green dots to two terms that you feel really confident you could explain to everyone else? And would you please drag your two yellow dots to two terms who you're unsure about? And when we say you're confident, you might know what the word means, but you might be shaking your explanation, or you might be, not confident, rather. You might be not unconfident in your how these words fit together, or you might be kind of unshaken how you'd explain it to someone else. So please drag the two green dots next to two words you are confident in. You can explain why they're here and what they mean, and drag your yellow dots to some words that you're not as confident in. I'm going to wait for the dots to settle down for just a moment, because if I show the screen right now, I want to be respectful of all of our viewers. There's a flurry going on there. All right, and I'm going to lock your responses, so hope your dots are where you want them, and we'll go ahead and share some of them. So many of us are pretty confident that we can talk about engagement or rigor or student-to-class interactions. Some of us are less confident in different areas of the brain, so the prefrontal cortex or the lower brain. So this tells us a few things. As a learner, right, it gets you involved in thinking about what do I know, what do I not know, and what do I need to learn more about. As an instructor in this potential PL session, that tells me where I need to spend some time and where I don't need to spend as much time about what you know and what you don't know. The second portion of the word splash asks you to do this. Would you please use your drawing fingers to draw some connections between these words? So whatever words you see connected and whatever way you can make a connection to them, please draw any connections that you see. These could be straight line connections, they could be dotted lines, they can be arcs, they can be however you see it connected. But if there are connections that you see between the words, please go ahead and note those now. So you might be connecting engagement with student-to-student interactions, or you might be connecting parts of their brain because they're probably connected, at least we hope. Whatever connections you see, please go ahead and draw them. Okay. So we'll showcase just a few drawings here, just to see some of the work in progress. But we're seeing some people are connecting different parts of the brain. Some people are connecting some of the other things that we mentioned. We see some circuitous routes.
So while Randy is figuring out and getting himself back, sorry guys, this is the first time this has happened quite this bad. But you know, technology, we deal with it, we're flexible. So Randy is showing one, I believe he's gonna show another one. And that's one of the things about Pear Deck or anything similar is that you can have kids show the different ways and the idea that there's not necessarily one pathway or one answer. That's part of the beauty of Word Splash is that it not only gets the kids invested in the words, because for some reason when we have them splashed across a page instead of, you know, in a straight down list, they're more invested. And so it's that idea of getting the kids again into the words with baby steps. First is, what do you feel like you know and can explain? What do you not? And deeper into that higher order thinking with what are some of those connections.
Mm-hmm. And so certainly we've just talked about, and you've experienced some of the ways it can happen synchronously. As Anissa was talking, you saw me scrolling through a variety of your responses, and I don't think any two of you thought about the words in the same way, which is neat. That's a cool thing for us to see, and what a wonderful insight for you as an educator to see what your students are seeing with vocabulary. So certainly that can be done synchronously via Pear Deck. But we might also have students print this out and submit a photo of their own representations of a word splash and how they're seeing connections, or their own annotations if we're thinking about an asynchronous application of this. Certainly in class, it would happen much the same as we just talked about, right? Where we might have peer conversations about words that we know and don't know, and we might share some of that knowledge and try to teach some other folks about, shore some of that up. We might also, again, talk about how these words are connected or why we're drawing lines between some of these words. And all of those are great insights into and making thinking visible and really starting that conversation about the topic at hand. So in
Randy,
short,
I'm sorry, Randy, before you get going on the steps, one of the things I just wanted to share is something that oftentimes happens in person, again, especially helping our struggling kiddos, is oftentimes when we are simply reading a word, we may not know how to pronounce it, and so it's very difficult discuss it with somebody orally. So oftentimes what we see teachers do is they actually pronounce the word for the kids. That's great if we're in person. We can even do it synchronously, like right now. We can say engagement, amygdala, so that we know how to say it. But if we're going to do this asynchronously, which we can do as well, we may want to consider how do we possibly audio record ourselves saying the word, so that as the kids are looking at the word splash with it on Google Classroom or what have you, they can actually hear that word as well. Or maybe part of it is, having them go to an online dictionary so that they can hear the word. But again, another really good way to use that so that they can get into some of the words. The other thing that I was thinking about, because we're working with some teachers this week and really focusing in on that perhaps the missed opportunities from the spring when we were doing emergency school. And so one of the things we know is we're going to have to try to work as smart as we can in figuring out where the kids are and what they might have missed. So Word Splash is a really great way, since we have 7 to 15 words. A lot of them are going to be the new words, as Randy's going to talk about in just a second, but some of them can be those words, the prior knowledge, the ones that they should have learned last spring, but we're not sure if they did or not. And so we can pull that in as well, not only as a review, but as a check for us to see where the kids are and where we need to spend our time.
Certainly. So as Anissa mentioned, that list of 7 to 15 words can be all brand new words. It can be a mix of words they're familiar with and unfamiliar with. And it might be a mix of words that they know, but maybe not in a particular context. But in any case, we recommend 15 as the upper limit, simply because in a 2-3 week unit, it's really tough to ask students to really get a deep and thorough understanding of how those words connect to each other if we go much beyond that. In this particular application of the Word Splash, we determined which words we're familiar with and had an opportunity to share some of the thinking. We did that today by me elevating some of your responses and seeing the dots. But certainly we could facilitate peer conversations in a synchronous session, have a discussion board post asynchronously or otherwise. We could also come back and determine which words we're unfamiliar with and share some guesses about what those words might mean. And again, those same options, discussion board posts, synchronous sessions are all applications of that. Drawing connections between the words is not an always happen step, but it sure does help, especially as the unit goes on. And that speaks to the last step, that a word splash isn't a one and done. If I'm going to take the time to splash these words in a PowerPoint slide and neatly arrange them in 15 different places, I want to come back to it and I want to get some mileage out of it, right? So coming back to it in the middle of the learning and asking, what new connections do you see between these words? Or even at the end of the lesson, how do these words connect now? Or what words can you now explain that you couldn't before? Are great ways to foster some metacognition with the students. It's another way for us to really check in with them and see what they know. And it's a great way for them to build their own kind of study guide, right? So this one activity at the beginning of the learning that hooked them in and trying to figure out how these words fit together can be revisited throughout the learning to help them build that knowledge base and really see what they're hanging on their schema as the learning develops. So we've talked about two strategies in detail today. We've talked about picture inductive model and the word splash, and you've experienced both of them. So we're going to ask you to think about one of those, whether it's picture inductive model or word splash. And aside from the content knowledge that you want to know, what are some of those implicit knowledge or skills that students might be able to need in order to participate in the learning? So if we're going to do this, right, it's not just having the strategy in place. There's the actual doing of it that kids need to know how to master as well. So are there specific apps they might need to learn to participate in these strategies? Are there different skills such as citing evidence that they might need to get a hang of? As you think about how either of these strategies might work for you, what are some of those soft skills that your kids are going to need to know in order to participate in this learning? So please take some time to drop some thinking in to Pear Deck here. See some great thinking come in. We'll go ahead and give you another moment or so to share that. Okay. And let's see some of those responses here. So first and foremost, students are going to need to know the platform that you're using, whether that's Google Meets, whether that is your Google Classroom or whatever learning management system, or Pear Deck as we use today. We're going to need to take some time up front to help give students some insight into how to use that. So whereas in normal school, in the before times, our first 2 weeks might have been, how do you sharpen your pencil in my room? Certainly, how do you access the learning in my room through these platforms is a consideration to think about. And to that end, we would recommend that you focus on 2 or 3 platforms or 2 or 3 apps that you want kids to know and focus on, so they're not overwhelmed and you're not overwhelmed in trying to get to know stuff. And that is echoed here in this second prompt as well, right? There we know in the switch to emergency learning that there may have been some students lost in the shuffle simply because we weren't prepared to pick them up. So as we go into this new school year, we need to think about how do we give students those skills to access technology and how do we check in with them throughout to be able to do that. Certainly.
So the dictionary is definitely something that can be really helpful. One of the things about Word Splash, especially as a hook, is that idea that we aren't giving them the definitions right away. We're asking them to really think and make as they go through the learning. But absolutely, it's a really good thing to pair with a graphic organizer so that as you're going through the unit or the lesson, the kids can fill that graphic organizer out and have those classroom definitions, like the true definition that you want them to know, the academic definition as they go through. So yes, definitely being able to use a dictionary. And as we've known as adults, having more windows, having more than open at once, it has been a challenge because we haven't necessarily had to do that, or at least definitely not in this type of setting. So we're looking forward to all the opportunities that we have as teachers this fall because we actually get to do school instead of that emergency schooling that we were doing in the spring.
Absolutely. That technical aspect is going to be something we need to think about. As Nissa spoke to, having more than one window open can be tough for us, and to get it wrap our heads around, it's going to be tough for our little ones as well. So certainly giving them some low stakes experience with that. So in a get to know you session, or get to know you Pear Deck, or so on and so forth, to help build relationships and familiar with the software is going to be key to get them really comfortable with those skills. As we come up to 4:30 here, And before we get ready to do a little housekeeping to end, we want to pause, see if there's any questions we had not addressed in chat. So Anissa, as you've been tracking things, and feel free to drop some things in chat right now too, if you are a participant. What are some things that we have not been able to get to just yet, quite yet?
So Randy, I think as far as using these actual strategies as hooks, I think we've addressed the ones that I've seen come up in chat. The things that we haven't addressed are the secondary outcomes, which is around Pear Deck. So spotlighting a particular app that you might be able to use, which is something that Randy and I are trying to these sessions. If you have questions around Pear Deck, let us know in a follow-up email, because we'll be sending a follow-up email to you with some resources. We're more than happy to meet with any of you guys for a quick little demo or what have you, especially around Pear Deck. We don't get a kickback from Pear Deck. We don't work for them, but we have found that both with adult learners as well as with kids, it has been really helpful in the synchronous session to try to get that engagement and do something a little bit different than just the chat. Chat is great, but it gives a little bit more dimension, as you saw with the drawing and with the dragging icons.
Okay. So we thank you all for sticking with us today, and we will stick around for some more questions and answers here in just a moment. But for those of you who must go, because we are coming up at 4:30, a feedback survey will come up for you as you leave our session here today. So we ask you to let us know how we're doing, and we thank you for the grace you showed us with me dealing with my connection issues. And so thank you, and we appreciate that patience that you had. But it also gives us an opportunity to let us know what you'd want to see from us in the future. We also use that feedback survey to track your attendance. So if you are someone who needs to say, who needs some physical proof that says, I spent this amount of hours in PL, our best evidence of your attendance is your response to that feedback survey. So please be mindful of that. And that feedback survey will have an exit ticket on it. And the exit ticket for this session is this: which upcoming learning targets would benefit from an in-person hook or an at-home hook, and for what reasons? So start thinking a little bit and start planning about, what do my kids need and when, and what kind of hooks might be important to them. Of course, we have an opportunity to respond in chat here, and we'll showcase those after a few more responses come in, or respond in Pear Deck here, sorry. I'll showcase those after some responses come in. And while it's coming in, again, we want to thank you for your time and for your attention today, and for taking time out of your Tuesday afternoon to spend some time with us. It's been a little slice of heaven. We've loved the conversation we've had so far. And let's see what you had to think. So some of us are thinking about introducing some stories, some story elements. Some of us are thinking about reading books. Some of us are thinking about how we're going to prepare for the fall and what they're going to need to do. So a variety of different ways that we're thinking about preparing for the year coming up. As you're finishing responses there and getting that last thought in, we do want to let you know that when the Pear Deck session ends, you're going to get a copy of your responses as well as these slides emailed to you. And we'll also send a follow-up email to you capturing some of the big ideas shared in chat here today. So with that said, Anissa, I'll turn it over to you for any parting words you might have, but it is coming up on 4:30 and I want to be respectful of everyone else's time. But we will stick around for any questions, answers, comments, concerns, or otherwise.
Yes, and a question came up about the recording. Yes, we will be sending a follow-up email that will include the recording, a summary, or any of the ideas that came up in chat and in Pear Deck, so that we continue to cross-pollinate and learn from each other, as well as a couple of resources, free resources for you guys to use and to share with your colleagues. So we really appreciate you being here to see, or at least have you here for another session, and just give us any feedback you can so that we can make these the most useful for y'all as possible. Thanks.